We still have a few people jumping on, but I want to be respectful of everybody's time. Welcome, and my name is Nancy Glazier. I work for Cornell Cooperative Extension on one of their regional teams, the Northwest New York team. Glad you could join us tonight. This is kind of a collaborative effort between Cooperative Extension's livestock program work team and the New York pork producers. Were interested in supporting this, and as well as New York State Ag and Markets. So we have Dr. Eireann Collins with us. She's going to give us a short talk on African swine fever, and then we'll get into some questions and answers after that. I am recording this and I will turn it off after her presentation so we can ask questions without being recorded. So Eireann, we'll let you get started.
Thank you, Nancy, and thank you all of you for joining us tonight and giving up your evening. I'm going to try and hit the highlights of African swine fever, just some topics on the global situation, what the virus is, where the US stands. And I really invite people after the presentation to feel free to ask any questions, either for now or if you want further resources on anything I talk about. As Nancy said, my name is Dr. Eireann Collins. I work for New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets, and I'm in the Division of Animal Industry. So animal industry, we have about 30 people in our division, and our main mission is to detect, control, and eradicate infectious diseases in food and fiber producing animals. So essentially our job is to protect New York State animal agriculture from disease, specifically high consequence or foreign animal diseases. And of course, swine is one of the more important commodity groups, both for the country and the state. So African swine fever is one of the biggest global threats to both the swine industry and pigs currently. It is a virus, so it's considered a large DNA enveloped virus. And like other viruses like influenza or COVID, within that virus, there can be many genotypes or different strains, and there can be some variety of virulence. As the name said, it originated in Africa. So it was discovered in Kenya in 1921. And that time it was really a disease of wild pigs. So your warthog, your bush pigs. It can infect feral swine or our domestic pigs, but again, in 1921, primarily in these reservoir hosts. At that time, the big reason that the virus was maintained was because there was a tick to pig to tick transmission. And the pigs were adapted to African swine fever, as were the ticks, and it just kind of rolled along as an endemic disease. Unfortunately, for our domestic pigs, it is highly infectious and highly fatal. And currently there is no vaccine to protect the pigs, and there's currently no treatment available. So even though it started in Africa in 1921, we started seeing the virus affect other parts of the world in the mid to late 1900s, and that was primarily through human trafficking rather than the warthogs traveling around on their little legs. So we see people taking pork products and feeding it to pigs, or garbage feeding at ports, or even the transport of infected wild boar for hunting preserves. In 2007, it's diagnosed in the Republic of Georgia. And from there, it spread to the Caucasus and into Russia. 2015, identified in Eastern Europe. And then unfortunately, 2018 rolls around. And in 2018, China reported African swine fever in domestic pigs for the first time. So China produces over 50% of the world's total pork supply. And you can see from this graph, today, there's 406 million pigs on feed in China, which is more than the next 7 countries combined, including the US. And in 2018, 98% of that Chinese pork production came from small-scale producers with less than 100 pigs. From China, it continued to spread throughout Southeast Asia, with over 50 countries infected. And again, in these other countries, 70% of those pigs are on these small-scale pig farms. It's estimated that by 2019, African swine fever had killed 25% of the world's pig population. So this is the world's pig population. And again, with China depopulating 100 million pigs, making this the most significant animal disease in human history, or in modern history, I should say. I just want to take a minute to talk about this picture, because for me, it really brings home the significance of this disease. So in animal agriculture, I think we really consider ourselves stewards, stewards of the animals that we raise, stewards of the food supply for both animals and humans, and stewards of the environment. And in this picture, you can see that these animals did not get to serve their purpose of entering into our food supply. We were not able to produce a safe, wholesome, affordable protein source from these pigs. The people in the picture are no doubt going to be affected both mentally and emotionally by the response efforts. And if they're owners, which they probably are, because these are small scale farms, are going to be economically devastated. And that's going to have impacts on their family and the people that they interact with, both at this occurrence and I would say into the future. And then finally, for environmental stewardship, the disposal option in this case is going to be incineration. You can see snow in the background. So they're going to burn these pigs and they're going to burn tires in order to maintain temperature. And that is going to have environmental impacts for all of us globally. So if nothing else in this lecture or webinar, I hope you take away that this is a very devastating disease for people who are directly impacted by it, but also for the rest of us and certainly the pigs. So how did it happen? How did we go from it kind of brewing along to all of a sudden 2018, 25% of the world's pig population is depopulated? The virus itself is extremely hardy, so it can survive for several days in feces. It can survive in contaminated pens, but you'll note that it can survive in processed pork, so dried hams, for almost a half a year, so 140 days, and in frozen carcasses or frozen meat for years. So again, as previously mentioned, feeding contaminated pork to pigs is a really efficient manner of transmission. And it's the best way to get it into a new country. So again, ingestion of these contaminated pork products fed to pigs either through swill, through waste, through garbage feeding, through carcasses. The picture on the right is from this September. Shocking as it may seem, that people try to illegally bring products into this country from countries that have African swine fever that we've banned. So in this case, it was about 30 kilograms of pork was intercepted at a Boston port, originally from Vietnam, which does have African swine fever. Once it's in a country, you can get transmission through direct contact with infected pigs. So all secretions can spread the virus, but it can also be spread, and very commonly is, in infected countries through clothing, vehicles, so the feed truck, the rendering truck, the UPS truck, equipment, just general environmental contamination, so water runoff with blood, diarrhea diarrhea or other feces. And then, of course, vectors. We discussed the soft tick, but there are other biting ticks that we believe could also act as vector-borne species. Once a pig, a naive domestic pig, is exposed to the virus, you'll typically see an incubation period about 5 to 21 days, so about a week to 3 weeks. And in our domestic pigs, again, we see a rapid morbidity and mortality. So we see them get sick very quickly, and then typically they succumb to the disease very quickly. In feral pigs, they may show fewer clinical signs. They may not get as sick. So that's a risk of them turning into a reservoir species, which is of particular concern in our southeast of the United States, where we do have feral pig populations. Clinical signs in our infected pigs: fever, inappetence, lethargy, weakness, and hemorrhage. So a lot of times we'll see these bleeding spots or the skin turning blue. Other signs include diarrhea, very often bloody diarrhea, abortion, respiratory disease, and again, a quick mortality. So 7 to 10 days, we often see death. On postmortem or on necropsy, we see a lot of hemorrhage of the internal organs, skin discoloration, or again, that sign of bloody diarrhea. This is kind of the background of African swine fever. I just want to go over a little bit of where we are on a global update 2021. So as I mentioned, 2018, China is originally infected. 2019, 2020, China announces they would start restocking their pig population to reach 90% of pre-African swine fever levels. And as I showed you in the other graph, they're already up to 406 million. They did not eradicate the disease in China. So it is still active there, but they are restocking. In May of this year, the Australian red meat industry announced that they had identified a new strain that had already killed 8 million pigs in that country. So it's still very active in China and in Southeast Asia, and probably also in Russia. In September of this year, African swine fever was identified in the Dominican Republic. So now it has been identified in the Western Hemisphere. And shortly after that, it was identified in Haiti, which shares the island of Hispaniola with the Dominican. As you can see from the map, as a refresher on our Caribbean geography, the Dominican Republic is very close to Puerto Rico. In fact, there is a daily ferry that goes between the Dominican and Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rico is a US territory. So by OIE standards currently, if Puerto Rico becomes infected, the US would be considered infected, which would have devastating consequences for international trade. So the USDA is working with the OIE to set Puerto Rico up as a surveillance zone. So in the chance that we did have an infection diagnosed in Puerto Rico, we could protect the mainland trade. However, that still puts us on great risk for this disease transferring from the Caribbean onto the continental United States, and New York is a gateway for that. We're a hub for international trade, for human traffic. We do have nationals from Puerto Rico, the Dominican, other Caribbean countries that make their home in New York. We also have other ports that do product import, both in our airports, but also by shipping. And as I mentioned before, it is not unusual for people who want to sell their product here to attempt to bypass our embargoes. This article is a little aged, but it again is not unusual, where our Beagle Brigade identified and stopped 50 shipping containers of illegal pork from entering the country. So if that pork did get in here and made its way into and it was infected and made its way into our pig population, this would be a very easy way to get African swine fever into our pork supply. Because garbage feeding is such a high-risk activity, the US does have regulations in place and requires garbage feeders to be licensed. We also require that garbage feeders cook garbage at time and temperature. So currently 27 states, including Florida, allow garbage feeding, as does Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. So of course, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, Florida being geographically closest to where we have active African swine fever in this hemisphere. Garbage feeding is prohibited in New York State. When we say garbage feeding, it means animal waste from handling, processing, preparation, cooking, so meat, offal, so that includes butchered parts of animals, and that does include hunted deer, and of course carcasses. So you should not, generally not a good idea to feed carcasses to your animals. I want to talk a little bit about offal here, especially considering the time of year we're in where there's deer hunting. And I know there have been cases where people think it might be a good idea to feed the pigs the field dressings from their deer. And generally speaking, that is, well, it is illegal in New York, but it also from a food safety perspective, it's not a good idea. We're talking about African swine fever today, but there are other diseases that can be transmitted through feeding of offal or carcasses. And in deer, those can include tuberculosis, lepto, brucellosis, salmonella, foot and mouth disease, and lead if you shot your deer with a lead bullet. DEC discourages that. So just please do not feed your deer waste to your pigs, regardless of African swine fever. Part of our prohibition against garbage feeding is that we do require people who are feeding swine to sign up for our swine feeder inspection program. So it's a yearly inspection. And while it is required, we consider it more of an education and outreach opportunity. So again, when you're feeding, you can't feed garbage, so no meat or offal. No animal parts, but we do allow food scrap recycling. So we can feed produce, bakery products, eggs, waste milk, anything that is not meat can be fed to pigs. We just ask that people do it responsibly. We also see our swine feeder inspection as an opportunity to build a relationship with our pork producers. If you are raising pigs and are currently not having a swine feeder inspection, you can either contact our main office, and I'll have that number at the end, or you can go on our website and identify the veterinarian or field inspector in your area and contact them directly to set one up. So as I mentioned, there's no vaccine and there's no treatment for African swine fever. So really the only way to prevent infection is through biosecurity. So at the national level, we have our port embargoes, we have surveillance programs in place, but at the farm level, it's really up to the producers to protect their stock. And really the best way to do that is to plan now. So plan when you don't need a plan. And the idea is not that you're going to be able to identify every scenario, but if you think about your options now, it'll be a little bit easier if you pre-make decisions on what you're going to do with your stock if we were infected by a foreign animal disease. One of the resources to help people, producers do this, is called the Secure Food Supply Plan. So Secure Food Supply is a voluntary program. It aims to protect livestock through biosecurity and also enable controlled risk movement of product. Again, for smaller or local farms, that might not be as important, but for our national integrated producers that may breed pigs in Minnesota, have a nursery in North Carolina, and then feed pigs in Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, or all three, it is very important that pigs be able to move. The principles of biosecurity is that it's the owner's responsibility to keep their animals from becoming infected. You know your animals better than anybody else could. And that routine biosecurity is not going to be sufficient for a novel, highly contagious disease. And I think we can all agree on that after the last couple of years. Another planning tool that's available is from the American Association of Swine Veterinarians and the Pork Checkoff. And this is the Farm Crisis Operation Planning Tool. So this was put together after COVID caused a lot of logistical issues for the swine industry. So this planning tool is really to help farms work through how they would deal with an animal disease emergency, a weather disease emergency, or other disaster that was going to affect normal operations. Also want to take an opportunity to discuss disease reporting with swine. So first thing is, if you have sick pigs, no matter what, your best first move at the farm level is to isolate the sick animal or animals and quarantine them from the rest of the herd. Next, you'd want to contact your herd veterinarian. And I know sometimes it can be difficult in New York State to find a swine-specific veterinarian, but if you have sick animals, reaching out to any large animal vet in your area can be worthwhile. They can work with our diagnostic lab to take samples and work with you to get a definitive diagnosis. With the Cornell Animal Health Diagnostic Lab in New York State, we do offer contract pricing to New York producers. So by working with a vet to get necropsy done or to get samples taken can really help to get a diagnosis if you have a disease event going on. Most of the time, a disease event hopefully is going to be just our endemic diseases in this country, PRRS or other respiratory issues. However, if you can't get a vet, or if you see signs that are very pathognomonic for African swine fever, that bloody diarrhea, that acute death, and you're really suspicious of the disease, you definitely can directly reach out to either USDA or our department, and we will get an inspector out there. When we do these inspections, just for your awareness, our mission is to rule in or rule out a foreign animal disease. So our priority is not necessarily going to be getting a diagnosis for why the animals were sick. It's just to make sure that it wasn't caused by African swine fever or another foreign animal disease affecting swine. So with that, I'm going to open it up for questions, and then maybe discuss some other resources that are available if there was a particular topic that you would like further information on.
Thanks, Dr. Collins. I'm just going to stop our recording here.